They say money can buy anything. But at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that would rewrite everything, $40 billion couldn't buy another breath for a dying baby. The Kensington mansion, marble floors that echoed like cathedrals, gold fixtures that caught moonlight like promises, had become a tomb. And inside the nursery, where each piece of furniture cost more than a car, where the wallpaper was hand-painted by an artist flown in from Florence, 18 of the world's most brilliant doctors stood helpless. Absolutely helpless. Baby Julian's lips had turned the color of a winter storm. Blue. Deep, unnatural blue. His tiny fingertips matched, and across his chest, a rash was spreading like spilled ink on silk. The heart monitor's frantic beeping had become a countdown. A pediatric cardiologist from Massachusetts General was on her fourth hypothesis. A toxicologist from the CDC was rechecking results that made no sense. A neonatologist who'd saved premature twins in a war zone was now pacing, hands trembling because this was different. Every test, inconclusive. Every treatment, failing. Every minute, slipping away. "We need to prepare for emergency surgery," someone said. Voices overlapped. Panic dressed in professional language. Equipment worth millions surrounded a baby who was worth everything to the Kensingtons, yet science, cold, precise, expensive science, had no answers. But pressed against the servant's entrance window, face fogging the glass that had never known the touch of someone like him, stood Leo Martinez. 14 years old. Son of Maria, the night shift housekeeper who cleaned the rooms where decisions were made but never made any herself. Leo wore a coat that had seen 3 winters too many and shoes that prayed to make it through one more. He'd spent his entire life being a ghost in this house. The kid who took the back stairs. Who knew which floorboards creaked. Who understood that his job was to exist without being seen. Right now, though, Leo wasn't looking at the chaos inside. He was staring at something every genius in that room had walked past. A potted plant on the nursery windowsill. Elegant. Expensive looking. Arrived 3 days ago with a bow and card. The leaves were a deep, glossy green. Beautiful even. But Leo's grandmother's voice echoed in his head, the grandmother who died 2 years ago but had taught him everything about plants before he could write his own name. Mijo, beauty can kill. Always look at the leaves. Always. His hands were shaking because he knew that leaf pattern. Knew the oily residue it left. Knew what happened when it touched skin, when its sap mixed with soap, when a well-meaning gardener, wearing contaminated gloves, touched a crib railing during cleaning. Digitalis lanata. Devil's trumpet. Angel killer. The doctors were about to cut that baby open looking for disease. The answer was in a ceramic pot wrapped like a gift. Leo glanced at the security guard making his rounds. Looked back at the kitchen door where his mother's silhouette moved, Maria, who'd warned him 1,000 times in Spanish and English. Stay invisible, Leo. We need this job. Don't give them a reason. He thought about what would happen if he burst in there, and was wrong. Thought about the headlines, housekeeper's son disrupts life-saving surgery. Thought about the streets they'd end up on. But he also thought about the baby's blue lips. About the 18 brilliant people who couldn't see what was right in front of them. About his grandmother's last words, "God gave you eyes to see what others miss, Mijo. Don't waste them." What would you do at that moment? When speaking up could save a life or destroy yours? When being right means nothing if no one believes you? Drop your answer in the comments, because what Leo did next didn't just break every rule his mother taught him. It broke every rule society had written for kids like him. Would you risk everything to save someone who never even learned your name? Leo's decision happened in the space between heartbeats. Before doubt could stop him, before logic could win, he moved. His worn sneakers made no sound as he slipped past the security guard, Marcus, who was checking his phone, who'd never once looked at Leo like he was a threat, because invisibility has its advantages. The side door to the nursery wing was supposed to be locked. But Leo knew it stuck when it rained, knew you could jimmy it with the right pressure, knew the blueprint of this house better than the people who owned it. 3 seconds. He was inside. The hallway smelled like disinfectant and desperation. Voices came from the nursery, sharp, urgent, medical jargon that sounded like a foreign language. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. Each step closer felt like walking toward a cliff edge. His mother's face flashed in his mind. The way she'd looked when she finally got this job after 6 months unemployed. The pride in her voice when she told his little sister they'd be okay now. All of it could end in the next 60 seconds. He reached the nursery door. Through the small window, he could see them, the doctors in their white coats like an army of angels who'd lost the battle. Baby Julian on the table, surrounded by machines and failing hope. And there, on the windowsill behind them all, the plant. It sat there like evidence at a crime scene nobody knew had happened. Leo's grandmother had told him stories about the family in their village who'd lost a child to Angel's trumpet poisoning, about how the symptoms looked like everything else until it was too late, about how Western doctors sometimes missed it because they weren't trained to see it. His hand touched the door handle. Cold metal. A threshold. On one side, invisibility, safety, silence. On the other, a voice that might not matter, a truth that might not be heard, a risk that could cost everything. The door opened. Every head turned. 18 pairs of eyes locked onto the brown-skinned boy in the too-thin coat who just walked into a room that cost more per square foot than his entire apartment building. The head surgeon, Dr. Catherine Blackwell, a woman whose name was on hospital wings, stopped mid-sentence. Her expression shifted from surprise to something harder. "How did you get in here?" "Security." Leo's voice came out smaller than he wanted. "The plant. The one on the windowsill. It's poisoning him." Silence. Not the good kind. The kind that happens before an explosion. A doctor near the back actually laughed. Short, sharp, dismissive. Another shook his head and returned to the monitors. Dr. Blackwell's jaw tightened. "Young man, this is a sterile medical environment. You need to leave immediately before you compromise." "I know what it looks like," Leo interrupted, and even he couldn't believe he'd just cut off a woman who'd probably never been interrupted in her life. "I know you think I'm nobody. But that plant, it's Digitalis lanata. My grandmother was a Karandra, a healer. She taught me. The gardener touched it 3 days ago. He touched the crib after. The baby's been breathing near it. The symptoms, they match. Everything matches." Another doctor, younger, maybe early 30s, stepped forward. "Kid, we've run every toxicology panel available. If there was plant poisoning, we'd have caught it." But there was something in his voice, the smallest crack of uncertainty, because they hadn't caught anything. Every test had come back as noise. If you've ever felt ignored when you knew you were right, if you've ever stood in a room where your voice seemed to disappear before it reached anyone's ears, hit that subscribe button. Because what happened next is exactly why some stories need to be told, and why some truths refuse to stay silent, no matter who's speaking them. Was Leo about to be thrown out by security, or was he about to expose what 18 doctors missed? Dr. Blackwell's hand was already raised, summoning security, when something impossible happened. The youngest doctor in the room, Dr. James Park, a resident from Stanford who'd only been invited because he'd published a paper on rare pediatric toxins, spoke up. "Wait." His voice cut through the tension like a surgical blade. "Wait. Just, what did you say the plant was?" Leo's throat was dry. "Digitalis lanata. My grandmother called it Trompeta del Diablo. Devil's trumpet. It looks like Angel's trumpet, but it's worse. The sap, it has cardiac glycosides. It slows the heart, turns extremities blue, causes rashes that look like allergic reactions. And it doesn't show up on standard tox screens because you have to specifically test for it. You have to know how to look." The room didn't breathe. Dr. Park moved toward the windowsill, pulled out his phone, started typing with frantic fingers. The other doctors watched him like he'd lost his mind. "James, we don't have time for—" Dr. Blackwell started, but he cut her off. "He's right. Look, Digitalis lanata. Rarely tested in North America because it's not native here. Symptoms, bradycardia, cyanosis, rash patterns that mimic autoimmune responses. And the detection window, it's narrow. If we don't catch it in the first 72 hours, it becomes almost invisible to standard panels." A cardiac monitor beeped. Baby Julian's heart rate was dropping. 82, 78, 74. Dr. Blackwell looked at the plant. Back to Leo. Her face was a war between pride and panic. "If you're wrong, we waste critical time. If we proceed with surgery, and you're right, we risk. If he's right," Dr. Park interrupted, "surgery kills him faster." The stress on a system already flooded with glycosides? He wouldn't survive the anesthesia. 60 seconds of chaos. Shouted orders. Someone running to get specialized test equipment from a lab across the city. Another doctor carefully removing the plant with gloved hands, holding it like a bomb. Leo stood frozen against the wall as his mother appeared in the doorway, her face a mixture of terror and confusion. Mijo, what did you do? But there was no time to explain. Dr. Park was drawing blood, racing against a clock that had maybe 10 minutes left. The specialized test would take 8. Baby Julian's lips were darker now, almost purple. His tiny chest rose and fell in shallow, weakening gasps. The room had transformed from dismissive to desperate. And Leo, the invisible boy, stood visible for the first time in his life, not knowing if he'd saved someone or destroyed everything. His mother gripped his shoulder. Not angry, terrified. "If you're wrong," she whispered in Spanish. "I know, Mama," he whispered back. "But if I'm right and say nothing." She had no answer for that. Neither did he. The numbers on the heart monitor kept dropping. 68, 64. The test was still processing. Dr. Blackwell was preparing Digibind, the antidote for digitalis poisoning, but she wouldn't administer it without confirmation. Couldn't. The room balanced on a knife's edge between salvation and catastrophe. Every second felt like drowning. Here's what I need to know. Have you ever had to make a choice where both options felt impossible? Where staying silent was unbearable, but speaking up felt like stepping off a cliff? Tell me in the comments what you would have done, because Leo's story isn't just about a plant or a baby. It's about every time someone without power had to decide if their truth was worth the risk. Would the test results come back in time? Or would they all watch helplessly as time simply ran out? Minute 6. Baby Julian's heart rate hit 58. In the corner, a neonatologist was whispering about preparing the family for the worst. The words brain damage and hospice floated through the air like ghosts. Leo's legs felt like water. His mother's grip on his shoulder tightened until it hurt, not out of anger, but because she was holding on to keep from collapsing. This was it. This was the moment where being right didn't matter if right came too late. Dr. Park's hands shook as he watched the test analyzer. The machine processing baby Julian's blood sample seemed to move in slow motion. Modern medicine, billions in research, equipment that could detect particles invisible to any microscope, and all came down to a timer on a screen. Dr. Blackwell stood with a preloaded syringe of Digibind in her hand, the antidote that could save Julian's life if Leo was right. But administering it without confirmation if Leo was wrong? It could trigger a cascade of complications that would kill the baby faster than whatever was actually wrong with him. 54 beats per minute. A nurse's voice cracked. "Doctor, we're losing him." Someone called for the crash cart. The room erupted into controlled chaos, the kind of organized panic that happens when professionals know they're out of options but refuse to stop fighting. Except Dr. Park, who stood frozen in front of that analyzer, and Leo, who'd never felt more powerless in his life. Then the machine beeped. A small sound. A sound that shouldn't have been able to cut through the noise of failing equipment and desperate voices, but somehow it did. Everyone stopped. Dr. Park's face went white as he read the screen. Then red. Then something else entirely, something between fury and relief. Positive. Digitalis glycosides. Levels are. He looked up, looked at Leo with an expression the boy would remember for the rest of his life. Levels are critical. He was right. The kid was right. What happened next happened fast. Dr. Blackwell didn't hesitate, didn't apologize, didn't waste a single second on anything except action. The syringe was in her hand, and then in baby Julian's 4-line in a movement, so practiced it looked like muscle memory. Digibind administered. Cardiac monitor talked to me. Seconds passed like hours. The room held its breath. 18 doctors, 2 nurses, 1 security guard who'd finally arrived but now stood uselessly in the doorway, 1 terrified mother, and 1 14-year-old boy who just bet everything on his grandmother's lessons. The heart monitor's number stopped dropping, held at 52. Then, 53, 54, 58, someone gasped. Baby Julian's lips, those terrible blue lips that had looked like death itself, began to change. Slowly, so slowly. But the purple faded to blue, blue faded to a dusky pink. His breathing deepened. 1 tiny hand, which had been limp, curled into a fist. If you believe that knowledge doesn't care about who has it, that truth can come from anywhere, that sometimes the most important voice in the room is the one nobody expected to hear, subscribe to this channel right now. Because this story isn't over, and what happened next proved that saving a life was only the beginning. Did Leo just become a hero, or did he just paint a target on his back? Baby Julian's heart rate stabilized at 78 beats per minute. Color returned to his face like sunrise after an endless night. The monitors that had been screaming now hummed with steady, stable rhythms. Dr. Blackwell stepped back from a table, pulled off her gloves, and for the first time in 3 hours, her shoulders dropped from around her ears. Around the room, doctors exchanged looks, some of relief, some of disbelief, and a few of something darker. Something that looked like embarrassment wrapped in expensive education. But Leo wasn't watching them. He was watching his mother, whose face was wet with tears she didn't remember crying. Maria Martinez, who cleaned the toilets in this mansion, who pressed the expensive shirts, who existed in the margins of other people's luxury, she was looking at her son like she'd never really seen him before. "Me, Joe," she whispered. Just that. Just the word for my son, in a voice that carried everything words couldn't hold. The nursery door burst open. Victor Kensington entered like weather, a man whose presence changed the pressure in a room. 46 years old, silver at his temples, wearing a suit that cost more than Leo's mother made in 6 months. His wife Dominique was right behind him, her face streaked with mascara and terror. They'd been in the study with lawyers and family advisors, preparing for the worst, when someone had run in shouting about a miracle. What happened? Victor's voice was command, not question. "Is my son?" "He's stable," Dr. Blackwell said, and her voice carried exhaustion like weight. "We administered Digibine for cardiac glycoside poisoning. He's responding well. He'll need monitoring, but he's going to be fine." Dominique Kensington made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and rushed to the bassinet where baby Julian was breathing steadily, his tiny chest rising and falling with blessed regularity. Victor's eyes swept the room, taking in the doctors, the equipment, the chaos, and landed on Leo. On the boy in the threadbare coat, standing against the wall like he was trying to disappear into it. "Who's this?" Victor asked, not unkind, just confused. Just a man who'd never had to learn the names of people he didn't need. Dr. Park spoke up. "Sir, this young man identified the poisoning. He recognized the plant. Without him, we would have..." He didn't finish. "I didn't need to. The surgery that had been minutes away would have killed baby Julian. Every doctor in the room knew it now." Victor Kensington looked at Leo properly for the first time. Really looked. Took in the worn clothes, the brown skin, the eyes that held knowledge that shouldn't have fit in a 14-year-old's face. "What's your name, son?" Leo's voice came out steady somehow. "Leo Martinez, sir. My mother works here. Maria Martinez. Night shift housekeeper." He saw his mother stiffen beside him, saw her preparing for dismissal, for the inevitable, "pack your things." Because that's what happened to people like them when they stepped out of line, even when stepping out of line meant saving a life. But Victor did something unexpected. He crossed the room in 3 strides and extended his hand. Not a pat on the head. Not a condescending gesture. A handshake. Man to man. "You saved my son's life." Leo took the hand. It was firm, warm, and shaking slightly, the tremor of a man who just stepped back from the edge of losing everything that mattered. "My grandmother taught me about plants, sir. I recognized it." The room was silent, watching, waiting to see what happened when worlds collided, when the invisible became visible, when the powerless held power, when everything everyone assumed about worth and wisdom got turned upside down in a single moment. What would you expect to happen next? A reward? A thank you? A quiet dismissal back into invisibility? Tell me in the comments what you think a life is worth, because what Victor Kensington did in the next 60 seconds didn't just change Leo's life. It exposed a truth that made some people in that room very, very uncomfortable. Was this the beginning of Leo's fairy tale ending, or was something darker waiting in the wings? Victor Kensington didn't let go of Leo's hand. Not right away. He stood there, this billionaire in a 3-piece suit, holding the hand of a housekeeper's son in a coat held together with hope, and something passed between them that didn't need words. Gratitude, recognition, the weight of a debt that couldn't be measured. You said your grandmother taught you, Victor finally said, his voice quieter now. She sounds like she was an extraordinary woman. She was, Leo replied. She died 2 years ago. But she used to say that plants have languages. If you learn to listen, they'll tell you what they can heal and what they can harm. Nobody else believed her. People said she was just, he trailed off, but everyone in the room could fill in the blank. Just an old woman. Just superstitious. Just from a place where real education didn't happen. She wasn't just anything, Victor said firmly. She was right. And she raised a grandson who saved my son when 18 of the most educated people in the world couldn't. That sentence landed like a stone in still water. Ripples spread across the faces of the doctors. Some looked down. Some suddenly found urgent reasons to check equipment that didn't need checking. Dr. Blackwell's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Because what could she say? It was true. Painfully, undeniably true. A 14-year-old with no medical degree, no fancy credentials, no letters after his name. He'd done what they couldn't. Victor turned to his wife. Dominique, we need to do something for this young man. Dominique Kensington, who'd been holding baby Julian and crying quiet tears of relief, looked up, nodded. Anything. Her voice was fierce with the kind of gratitude that comes from having your world almost end and then being handed back the pieces. Anything at all. And this is where fairy tales usually end, right? The rich family rewards the poor boy. Everyone learns a lesson, credits roll. But if you've been paying attention to how the world actually works, you know it's never that simple. Because in the corner of the room, Dr. Richard Caulfield, one of the senior physicians from Johns Hopkins, a man who'd written textbooks and trained hundreds of doctors, was whispering to a colleague. Whispering just loud enough that Leo could hear. We would have caught it. Given more time, we would have identified the glycosides. This is being blown out of proportion. Leo heard it. His mother heard it. Dr. Park heard it. And his face flushed red. But before anyone could respond, Victor spoke again. I want to know how that plant got into my son's nursery. I want to know who sent it when it arrived and who handled it. Someone nearly killed my son. His voice had changed. Gone was the grateful father. In his place stood the man who'd built an empire, who didn't accept accidents or coincidences, who viewed the world as patterns to be analyzed and problems to be solved. A security coordinator who'd been standing quietly by the door stepped forward. Sir, the plant was delivered 3 days ago. It came with the other gifts. There have been hundreds since baby Julian was born. It had a card but no return address. Just said, congratulations from an admirer. We screened everything for obvious threats, but decorative plants didn't trigger any protocols. Victor's eyes went cold. Update the protocols. And I want the footage. I want to see who delivered it, what service they used, everything. The room shifted. Because now this wasn't just about a medical emergency averted. It was about the possibility, the strange, unsettling possibility, that this hadn't been an accident at all. That someone had sent a poisonous plant to a billionaire's nursery, disguised as a gift. And if that was true, then Leo hadn't just saved baby Julian's life. He'd exposed a threat that was still out there. Subscribe to this channel if you want to see where this goes, because what started as a medical emergency was about to become something else entirely. And Leo, who'd spent his whole life trying to be invisible, was about to learn that some kinds of visibility you can't escape. Had someone really tried to kill baby Julian, or was this just a terrible accident? And either way, what did it mean for the boy who'd stopped it? The investigation moved fast. When you have Victor Kensington's resources and a potential threat to your family, things that would normally take weeks happen in hours. By dawn, security footage had been pulled, delivery services had been contacted, and a very uncomfortable truth had emerged. The plant hadn't come from a legitimate gift service. It had been hand-delivered by someone who'd signed in using a fake name and a stolen ID from a florist company that had gone out of business 6 months ago. The person on the camera wore a hat, sunglasses, and moved with the practiced ease of someone who knew exactly how to avoid identification. Leo sat in the Kensington study, an actual study, not the servants' quarters or the kitchen where he'd spent his whole life confined, listening to security experts explain what they'd found. His mother sat beside him, still in her cleaning uniform, looking like she might shatter if someone spoke too loudly. Victor paced. Dominique held baby Julian, who was sleeping peacefully now, completely unaware that he'd almost died, or that his survival had cracked open something dark. This was deliberate, the head of security said. His name was Marcus Reeves, former Secret Service, the kind of professional who didn't speculate without evidence. Someone knew what they were doing. Choose a plant that looks decorative, that wouldn't trigger security screening, but that's lethally toxic if handled wrong. They disguised the delivery to avoid tracing. This wasn't a mistake. This was an attack. The word hung in the air like poison gas. Attack. Against a 3-month-old baby. Against someone who'd never done anything except be born into wealth and inherit enemies that came with it. Victor stopped pacing. Who would do this? His voice was quiet, which somehow made it more dangerous than if he'd shouted. Business rivals? Someone I've outbid? He stopped. I looked at his wife. Some conversation passed between them wordlessly. Dominique's voice was soft but clear. Your brother. Victor's face went white, then red. Thomas wouldn't. Victor, you wrote him out of the will when Julian was born. You said the company needed clear succession, that Thomas's lifestyle made him a liability. He called me. He was angry. He said she looked at baby Julian sleeping in her arms. He said you'd regret choosing a baby over blood. The room went silent. This was a family drama at a level Leo had no frame of reference for. His family's biggest conflicts were about rent money and work schedules. These people's conflicts involved billions and apparently attempted murder. But what chilled Leo most was the look on Victor's face. Not disbelief, not a shock, just resignation. Like he'd always known his brother was capable of this, but had hoped he was wrong. Find him, Victor said to Marcus. Carefully. If Thomas did this, I need proof. Legal proof. And if he didn't finish, but the implication was clear. Either way, this ended badly for someone. Marcus nodded, and left with 2 other security personnel. The study suddenly felt smaller, more intimate. Victor turned to Leo and Maria. I owe you more than gratitude. You need to understand, if this was an attack, if Thomas is behind it, then he knows it failed. And he'll know eventually that someone identified the poison. Leo felt something cold slide down his spine. You're saying we're in danger. It wasn't a question. Victor's silence was answered enough. Maria stood up abruptly. No, you don't get to do this. We save your son. We don't get pulled into your families, whatever this is. We're leaving. Tonight. We'll find work somewhere else. Somewhere safe. But Victor shook his head. It's too late for that. If Thomas connects Leo to the plant identification, if he decides loose ends need cutting, he didn't have to finish. Leo looked at his mother. Saw her fear. I saw her anger. Saw the terrible realization that doing the right thing had put them in more danger than staying silent ever would have. This was the cost of visibility. The price of mattering. You couldn't save someone powerful and then just disappear back into the margins. Not when powerful people had enemies. Not when those enemies were desperate. Have you ever done the right thing and realized too late that it came with consequences you never saw coming? That helping someone put a target on your back you didn't ask for? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because Leo was about to learn that heroism in real life doesn't end with a thank you and a reward. Sometimes it ends with having to choose between safety and truth all over again. What would you do if saving a life meant risking your own? Victor Kensington made a decision that night that would change everything. He didn't send Leo and Maria away. He didn't offer them money and a quiet disappearance. Instead, he did something that made Maria's hand shake and Leo's heart pound. He moved them into the main house, into the guest wing, into rooms with windows that overlooked gardens instead of parking lots, with beds that didn't sag in the middle, with the kind of safety that came with guards and gates and surveillance systems. Until we know what we're dealing with, Victor explained, you're safest here. Close. Protected. Maria wanted to argue. Leo could see it in her eyes, the pride that said they didn't need charity, the fear that said accepting it made them indebted, the practical terror that said this world wasn't built for people like them. But she looked at Leo, at her 14-year-old son who'd somehow become tangled in a billionaire's family war, and she nodded. Because safety mattered more than pride. The first night in the guest wing, Leo couldn't sleep. The bed was too soft. The room is too quiet. Through his window, he could see the nursery wing, lit up now with extra security lights, guards posted at every entrance. Baby Julian was in there, alive because Leo had spoken up. But somewhere out there, maybe close, maybe far, was someone who tried to kill an infant and failed. And they knew they'd failed. Morning came with news. Marcus Reeves found Victor in his office where Leo and his mother had been summoned. Thomas Kensington left the country yesterday morning. Private flight to Monaco. He's in a non-extradition territory. Victor's jaw clenched so hard Leo heard it. Convenient timing. Very, Marcus agreed. But here's the interesting part. His financial records show a payment of $50,000 to a shell company 3 weeks ago. We're tracing it, but the layers are sophisticated. Professional. $50,000 to murder a baby. Leo felt sick. Felt the kind of rage that comes from understanding how cheap some people think life is, or how expensive, depending on what that life threatens. Can we prove it? Victor asked. Marcus hesitated. Not yet, but we're working angles. The delivery person, the shell company, phone records. If Thomas made a mistake anywhere, we'll find it. If. That word carried a lot of weight. Because if they couldn't prove it, then Thomas was free. Free and angry and aware that his plan had failed. And failures have witnesses. Leo specifically. Over the next 3 days, life became surreal. Leo still went to school, but now in a car with a driver and a security tail. His mother still worked, but now her job was redefined as household management consultant with a salary that made her cry in private. The Kensingtons treated them like family, but there was always this strange tension underneath. Gratitude mixed with guilt mixed with the awareness that they were from different worlds and circumstances had just forced those worlds to collide. Dr. Park visited on day 4. He found Leo in the library, an actual library with first editions and rolling ladders, and sat down without asking. I wanted to apologize, he said. Leo looked up from a book on medicinal plants he'd found. For what? For almost dismissing you. For almost being one of the people who walked past the answer because I was too busy looking at expensive equipment and my own education. You humbled me. Reminds me that knowledge comes from everywhere if we're willing to listen. It was maybe the most genuine thing any adult outside his family had ever said to Leo. My grandmother used to say that too. That learning happens when you stop thinking you already know everything. Dr. Park smiled. Sad but real. She was right. About a lot of things, I'm guessing. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Dr. Park pulled out a folder. I have something for you. Well, Victor and I have something for you. If this story is reminding you that the world is more complicated than good guys and bad guys, that doing the right thing can open doors and target you at the same time, that heroism is messy and complicated, subscribe now. Because what Dr. Park handed Leo in that library wasn't just a gift. It was an offer that would force him to decide who he wanted to become. Was Leo about to get everything he'd ever dreamed of, or was he about to face an impossible choice? The folder contained a letter on heavy cardstock, the kind of paper that announced importance before you even read the words. Leo's hands trembled as he opened it. At the top, an embossed seal, Stanford University School of Medicine, Pre-College Honors Program. His eyes scanned the text. Words jumped out. Exceptional aptitude. Full scholarship. Mentorship track. Early admission pathway. Dr. Park watched him read. Victor pulled some strings. I made some calls. But honestly, after I told them what you did, what you knew at 14, with no formal training, they didn't need convincing. They need students who can think, who can see what others miss, who have instincts that can't be taught. Leo's throat closed up. This was the dream. The impossible, never even dared to speak it out loud dream. Medical school. A path out of invisibility, not through luck, but through legitimate recognition. His grandmother's knowledge validated, transformed into something the world would respect. He looked up at Dr. Park with tears he didn't try to hide. How do I even? You say yes, Dr. Park said gently. You let yourself have this. You earned it. But Leo thought about his mother. About his 10-year-old sister Rosa, who'd been staying with their aunt because the Kensington guest wing wasn't set up for 3. About the life they'd built on the margins that was small but theirs. The program is residential, Dr. Park continued, reading Leo's silence correctly. You'd live on campus. Summer's off. But it's in California. It's a long way from here. A long way from Maria, who'd sacrificed everything to keep her kids fed and safe. A long way from the only neighborhood Leo had ever known. "Take time to think about it," Dr. Park said, standing. "Talk to your mom. But Leo, don't say no out of fear. Don't make yourself smaller because you're worried about what it means to take up space." After he left, Leo sat in the library holding the letter like it might dissolve. He thought about two versions of himself. One who went to Stanford, who became Dr. Leo Martinez, who made his grandmother's legacy real in ways she'd never lived to see. And one who stayed, who kept his family together, who didn't risk losing the people he loved by chasing a dream that felt too big. That night, he told his mother. They sat in her room, Maria's room, with its view of gardens she used to only see from service entrances, and he showed her the letter. She read it slowly, lips moving slightly with each word. When she finished, she was crying. "Mijo, this is everything. But you'd be here alone with Rosa. I'd miss years of her growing up. I'd miss," she put her hand over his mouth. Gentle but firm. "You'd miss nothing that matters more than this. You think I came to this country, you think I cleaned toilets and scrubbed floors and worked nights, for what? So you could stay safe and small? No, I did it so you could be big. So you could take up all the space you deserve." Leo cried then. I really cried. The kind of crying that's grief and joy and terror, all mixed together. Maria held him like he was small again, rocked him and whispered in Spanish about his grandmother, about dreams, about the kind of courage it takes to let yourself be extraordinary when the world has spent your whole life telling you to be invisible. "What if I fail?" Leo whispered. "What if I get there, and I'm not good enough?" "Then you fail," Maria said simply. "And you learn, and you try again. But Mijo, what if you don't fail? What if you're exactly as brilliant as I've always known you are? You're going to deny the world that because you're scared." She pulled back, looked him in the eyes. "Your abuela didn't teach you about plants so you could keep the knowledge quiet. She taught you so you could save lives. So go. Go save lives. Make her name mean something to people who never got to hear her speak." What would you tell someone standing at a crossroads like this? When staying feels safe, but leaving feels like destiny? Tell me in the comments what matters more, security or potential, because Leo's answer would define not just his future, but what his story actually meant. Did he have the courage to bet on himself, even when the stakes were his family's comfort and his own fear? 3 months later, Leo stood in his dorm room at Stanford. Boxes half unpacked. A poster of DNA helixes on one wall. On his desk, a framed photo of his grandmother holding a bundle of herbs, smiling at the camera with the kind of joy that comes from knowing your purpose. Next to it, a newer photo. Maria and Rosa at the airport, both crying and laughing as they sent him off. Rosa had made him promise to video call every night. He'd promised, knowing he'd try even though it wouldn't always be possible. The program was hard. Harder than anything Leo had ever experienced. Students from elite prep schools who'd been groomed for medical careers since birth. Kids who spoke 3 languages and had parents who were surgeons, researchers, professors. Leo was the only scholarship student from a public school in his cohort. The only one whose mother cleaned houses. The only one who sometimes still felt like an imposter wearing someone else's clothes. But he wasn't alone. Dr. Park had connected him with mentors. Victor Kensington had set up a fund, not charity, he'd insisted, but investment in someone who'd save his son's life and deserved every opportunity. And Leo had something none of the other students had, a grandmother's legacy of knowledge that didn't come from textbooks. When they studied pharmacology, Leo contributed insights about plant-based compounds that made professors stop and take notes. When they discussed diagnostic thinking, Leo talked about pattern recognition learned from watching how leaves change color or how roots grew. He wasn't the top of his class. Not at first. But he was learning, growing, becoming someone who could bridge worlds, traditional medicine and ancestral knowledge, institutional power and grassroots wisdom. Back home, Maria had been promoted. Not because of pity, but because Dominique Kensington had recognized that anyone who'd raised a son like Leo while working 3 jobs had management skills that most people with MBAs never learned. Rosa was thriving, attending a better school now with resources that gave her chances Maria and Leo never had. And baby Julian, he turned 1 year old with a party that made the news. In every article, in every interview, Victor Kensington told the story. About the plant. About the 18 doctors. About the 14-year-old housekeeper's son who saw what they all missed. Some people called it luck. Victor called it justice, the kind that happens when people stop assuming worth is determined by wealth or credentials. Thomas Kensington never came back to the country. The investigation had found enough evidence to charge him, though not convict. But the court of public opinion and the family's private decisions had made him an exile. His inheritance went to medical research funds focusing on accessible healthcare. Poetic justice, some said. Expensive revenge, others said. Leo just thought it was sad that someone could value money over life so completely. On his desk next to the photos was one more thing, a small potted plant. Not Digitalis lanata. This one was Salvia rosmarinus, rosemary, for remembrance. His grandmother used to keep it in every room. So we don't forget where we come from, she'd said. Leo touched the leaves sometimes when studying got hard, when he felt too far from home, when the pressure made him want to quit. The smell would ground him, remind him. He thought about the night in the nursery sometimes, about the moment he chose to speak instead of staying silent, about how that single choice had cascaded into a life he never could have imagined. It wasn't a fairy tale. There were hard days. Days when other students looked at him like he didn't belong. Days when he missed his family so much it physically hurt. Days when he wondered if he'd made the right choice. But then he'd remember baby Julian's blue, lips turning pink. Remember Dr. Park's apology. Remember his mother saying, make her name mean something. And he'd know. Not believe, know that some moments ask you to be brave not because it's easy or guaranteed, but because staying silent is a kind of death too. Because being invisible isn't the same as being safe. Because the world changes when people who've been told they don't matter refuse to believe it. Years from now, Leo Martinez would become Dr. Leo Martinez, would publish papers on integrative medicine, would open clinics in underserved communities where grandmother's knowledge and modern technology work together, would train a generation of doctors who understood that wisdom doesn't have prerequisites and truth doesn't check credentials at the door. But that night, unpacking boxes in a dorm room far from home, he was just a kid who'd bet on himself because his family had bet on him first. Just someone who'd learned that the most powerful thing you can do in a world that wants you invisible is to insist on being seen. Not for validation, not for approval, but because your voice might be the one that saves a life. And that's worth every risk. What Leo didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that baby Julian would grow up asking about the boy who saved him. Would eventually go to medical school himself. Would at age 28 launch a foundation with Leo called the Seen and Heard Initiative, funding medical education for students from marginalized communities. The boy who almost died and the boy who saved him would change thousands of lives together. But that's another story. One that started with a plant, a choice, and a kid who refused to stay quiet when it mattered most. This is what happens when we listen. When we make space for voices we're trained to ignore. When we remember that expertise can look like a PhD or like a grandmother's hands teaching her grandson which leaves heal and which ones kill. The world doesn't change because powerful people decide to be generous. It changes because people without power decide to speak anyway. And sometimes, just sometimes, someone actually listens.